Hi everyone, welcome to Brothers, Sisters, Strangers video podcast. I'm Ali John Chaudhry, psychotherapist, and today we're going to be talking about birth order and the ramifications of sibling estrangement. And I'm here with Fern.
I'm Fern Chapman, the author of the upcoming book, Brothers, Sisters, Strangers, Sibling Estrangement and the Road to Reconciliation, which will be released April 2021, just in time for National Siblings Day.
Great timing, by the way.
I think they planned it that way.
That's great, actually. I like that. I like that a lot. So let's get on to what we were going to be talking about, you and I, Fern. Last time we talked about birth order and such, and talked about adverse birth order theory and the importance of the social aspect in a family and a community as the prevailing factor of influence for the development of a child's personality. And of course, the risks involved in developing estrangement if unhealthy expressions prevail over the healthier ones.
Right.
So we were talking about all the different types of birth order positions, and we were left with talking about the youngest child. Now, we kind of ended by saying that sometimes the rules don't seem to apply to the younger children. And I kind of wanted to mention that that statement is inconclusive, I have to say, because I don't think it's necessarily that the rules don't apply to them, but there's all sorts of differences that can influence parenting and such. And I suspect that parents get better over time. When they've had a few children, they can learn from their errors and mistakes, and it can be seen in some ways as if the older ones somehow aren't treated the same.
I'll tell you a funny story about that, Ollie John. I used to tell my oldest son that he was the firstborn and a little like pancakes, that you ruin the first one.
That's good. That's actually pretty good, yeah. It makes perfect sense when you think about it, right? We all get better over time the more we do stuff. And I would see how it would affect the older ones too, and seeing that somehow the expectations might be higher towards them, whereas they might see that the younger ones don't have the same level of rules as they would have. So there is that difference that might explain why it is that we get the sense that the younger children don't always have to follow the rules. It's because, again, there's changes according to age and such too that play into that. And what's been shown is that the last-born does get more attention coming from the parents because perhaps they're younger, and the elder siblings learn to become more independent. And some of the traits that are associated with the youngest child are usually that they're charming, not outgoing. They can be attention seekers, and in other cases they can feel inferior, like everyone is bigger or more capable. But what that can do on a positive level is that can cause them to become speedier in development to catch up to their siblings, so they learn faster. So I like that a lot. I don't know if that's been something you've observed, Fern, on your end.
Well, I'm the youngest of two, and obviously all of these theories and studies that you're raising here are generalities. So many other factors play into it, such as personality and gender, as we discussed earlier. So it's really hard to quantify this whole thing, but I think you're talking in generalities, and there are certain trends. And I can say as a parent, there's no doubt that the expectations are placed on the older child, unfortunately, and the younger ones benefit from that as well. But I think, I have 3 children, and there's a very big difference in the dynamic between 3 versus 2. And one of the problems for me in terms of estrangement, as I've mentioned to you before, is if there was a cutoff between my brother and me, that meant I had no access to a whole family and the sense of belonging.
Yeah. So we're going to be getting into some of those consequences that come with estrangement in a few minutes. But I absolutely agree with you. I think that it's it's based on some of the research we've seen, and of course, there's other research, of course, out there on, as we said, gender differences and such, and different aspects can be taken into consideration here. So we are talking on a general level, and we are trying, of course, to be as inclusive as possible and as open as possible to this. So everything we're saying when it comes to all this is, of course, taken with a grain of salt with other factors involved, of course. So yes, I would definitely agree with you. Now, a good question to explore also is, what does it mean towards relationships with other siblings and estrangement potentially, being the youngest child? And I think this is important because once you get down the line, you can get the sense that you need to catch up. And what that does is that can sometimes create a bit of a susceptibility to comparisons to others, which in some ways can translate as being jealous. And what that can do is that certain siblings that might be older, that might be more bossy, for example, can sometimes trigger a sense of defensiveness that can bring a sibling to pull back. And once they start to pull back to regain control, it's almost as if there can be sometimes a sense of that they're being somehow empowered by doing that, but yet they're causing estrangement when they do that. So there can sometimes be a bit of that confusion where you think you're empowering yourself, but yet you're not. You're missing out on certain opportunities potentially here. And on the other hand, healthy expressions of the young child can be that the youngest child learns to assert themselves more. They can manage conflict if and when adversity arises because they've largely come into a democratic system that makes that they have to, of course, make their voices known and such. So depending on which way the chips fall, you're going to be able to determine if you have healthy or unhealthy expressions. And it's a good question to ask ourselves, like if the family was able to speak out and manage conflict, for example, did they make their needs known? And so if you have those elements, and if you kind of reflect on your own family and ask yourselves, particularly to our viewers here, I think that this will be an interesting way to analyze whether the factors within our families are there to be able to help us to manage conflict and address it in a proactive way, as opposed to a reactive way.
I think that's a really interesting point, which I've never given much thought to, but I will tell you that I was the youngest and I was very outspoken in the family. And both my mother and brother were quite frightened of my dad, who was almost tyrannical. So, but I really bucked that. And at times they were angry at me for speaking out so forcefully and creating more issues in the family.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So again, there are expectations because of the fact that you're singling out certain things that are left unspoken, so to speak. And oftentimes that's what the person that's usually the black sheep would do, because we don't stand for hypocrisy. I would do the same thing in my own family. I was the oldest of two, and I would often be the one to bring out certain issues, and I would have to do that a few times, and never quite getting my parents to necessarily agree with me on that. So it was a lifelong process, so to speak.
I think you're raising some interesting questions and issues that come up with estrangement, no matter where you are in this estrangement picture. And that is that it creates moral questions. All of us have to live with ourselves. And what are you willing to tolerate within yourself? And this applies to speaking out in the family, or speaking out in terms of if you're a parent whose one child is estranged another. They represent very fundamental moral questions. And actually, it's not that different from the questions you see that are raised when there's bullying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's very important what you're saying there, because it's true. There are aspects of bullying that, if they're left unaddressed, they can exacerbate, become worse over time. And you'll notice the commonalities between bullying and estrangement in terms of the dominance and the power struggle. So,
well, you see this with family members, Ali
yes.
John. So in other words, a mother, like I said, who decides not to say anything and simply tolerate the behavior she sees in one child who estranges another. You know, these, like I said, they're moral questions. It's fascinating to me because it's very similar to larger issues such as Nazi Germany. Do you go along with the community that's abusing a certain group of people, or do you stand up and say, I'm not going to tolerate that? And, you know, one of the things that created a lot of resentment in my own family is my mother not only tolerated, but she often went to my brother's family functions and basically facilitated his estranging me because I wasn't on that guest list. And so, you know, I felt very hurt at times that she was willing to go and be a part of his family functions when I wasn't included on the list. And of course, her argument was always, yeah, but I never see him, and this is, I'm going to take the little I can get. I mean, I see the argument. My personal feeling is if my kids were to do this, every family member needs to be included on every family guest list. And it's up to individuals if they want to come or not. You know, I just don't think you can pick and choose who your family members are.
I think this is important what you're saying here too, the tend and befriend approach that we've talked about last time in our video. I think that that's an important approach to have, because if you become too rigid and you start to want to have that estrangement somehow dominate or define the relationship, it makes it all that harder in social events like this, because people miss out on opportunities that can sometimes be once in a lifetime. And I completely understand what you're saying. I was smiling earlier just because I was seeing a lot of myself in what you were saying. And I think that there's my own experiences also that have enabled estrangement, unfortunately, is something I think we should bring up here. You know, my sister invited me to her wedding, and I actually canceled my graduation for a course that I was taking in New York State. And it was told to me that basically I wouldn't be allowed to go on the podium and speak on my sister's behalf for whatever reason, you know. And basically what happened is I asked her a few times, well, are you going to let me go? And I never was really given a reason why. So eventually I show up at the wedding. I'm there, and I'm at the banquet table, and basically everybody's getting excited and saying, oh, wow, that was a good speech. When's your turn coming up, Ali John? And I was put in a position where I had to say, well, my turn isn't coming. I'm not allowed to go on the podium and speak. So I had to say this to some family members, and that created a huge awkwardness at the table. But basically people just almost shut down. They didn't know what to say. And I felt bad with it, that I had to acknowledge that type of nonsense, you know. And, you know, I never actually got an answer to that. Never actually got an answer as to why I wasn't allowed to go on the podium and speak. And that was very hurtful for me, because that was one of the incidences that cemented the estrangement that we have in our adult life between my sister and I.
It's really unfortunate that you didn't have a chance to ever talk about it. And also the way that the people at the table responded to you really shows you the stigma of estrangement. Nobody knows what to do with it. They don't know how to handle a situation where a brother and sister, or a brother and brother, or sister and sister don't talk to one another. And one of the experiences I had is, while people were infinitely curious about what I was doing, and they always leaned in a little closer to learn about sibling estrangement, they also almost back away because they don't want any part of this, and they worry it might be contagious or something. So it's an interesting response. I feel for you, and certainly when you are not invited to family events, it is deeply wounding. And I had that experience many, many times with my formerly estranged brother. You know, to flip to, I was thinking about this while you were talking, and this is going to change the subject a tiny bit, but I just want to mention that one of the things that also happens when there is estrangement, particularly as we age, is that one person, in my case, I became much more responsible for the parents. So I was the one who allowed my parents to have a role in the grandchildren's lives. I was the one who was helping my parents when they needed it with buying a car or fixing the house or whatever it was. And all of the burden of being a child fell on me because my brother wasn't having anything to do with me and not so much to do with the parents. So, because he had cut off from much of the family, or at least had a very limited relationship. So, you know, I think I used to call it the committee of one because I was always the one making the decisions and having to run the household. And that's really a difficult spot as well. What I'm really trying to say is this stuff ripples through the family and throughout the years, and even to the end of life issues particularly.
Mm-hmm. I would agree, and I think that this is what happens too, because in certain end of life situations, I've spoken recently with some people working at the hospital, and they've told me that it happens on a fairly regular basis that families collide with each other. They actually come to you know, the sick bed or the deathbed of their parent, and they don't want to see each other. It's like, what are you doing here? You know, and in even extreme cases, it's come to blows where the police needed to be called. And doesn't happen often, mind you, but still, it can. And but that's the thing, though, is that this occurrence happens on a more regular basis than we would like to think. And I think it's important to realize that this awkwardness, this estrangement that's being maintained, can sometimes overshadow the unfortunate incident of somebody that's on their way out. And it becomes really important to be able to prioritize what's important. In some cases, prioritize what matters most. And I have to applaud the hospital staff, because in some cases they've even chosen to spontaneously say, okay, well, your side of the family goes on Wednesdays, your side of the family goes on Thursdays, for example, just to maintain the peace. So everybody gets to have access to that family member, and nobody's left out.
The parents' end of life issues really throw estranged children at each other again, because they can go along for years without talking to each other. But then when the parents have needs and they feel some obligation to them, they are confronted with one another again. And it's actually in some of the stickiest situations, because you're talking about estate settling and caregiving, and funeral arrangements. And all of those things can be really complicated for those who can't get along at a family function.
And that's the thing too. I think even with funerals, for example, that's also another issue that can happen, because it can be heartbreaking when you have that type of exclusion, because if you don't get to say your goodbyes in a healthy way, that can catch up to you in all sorts of ways, as you well know, as we've spoken of in the past, the importance of ritual. And if there's an absence of ritual, then that also can have negative consequences that can, of course, create other types of damages because of estrangement.
Well, I think we're almost out of time, but I think I'd like to conclude by saying I believe that if you can maintain some shred of a relationship, it will spare you some of the pain at those end of life issues. So it doesn't have to be a particularly fulfilling experience, but at least so you can talk to one another and deal with these questions that come up at the very end of life. That is far preferable to being thrown into this again and having all the hostility of all these former fights come up as you try to negotiate the end of life of a parent, for a parent.
I agree. If both sides could be able to see what the bigger issues are, as you say, Fern, I think that's what's important, to keep our eye on what's most important, on what the priority is, and to not get stuck in necessarily in conflicts, not to forget them, not to know that they're not there. I think it's, we all feel that, and we all know that's still happening on some levels, but yet again recognizing what's at play, that's bigger and that's happening in that moment, that is life altering and life changing. Remember that.
And I think COVID has underscored this. You know,
Mm-hmm.
it really makes the point that none of us have any guarantees. So if you're going to have a relationship, you need to work it out now, because we don't know what's going to happen, particularly in this health environment. So
it's what we don't do that we end up regretting the most. And it's something to consider also, depending, of course, on the severity of the estrangement and such. I would say, yes, consider it, as we're saying right now.
well, it's always great to be with you, Ali John, and I'm glad we got to talk about some of the experiences and the ramifications of estrangement, because this is such a deep issue, and it reaches out into years and experiences and relationships throughout a life. And I think it's really important to identify all the ways in which this very toxic sibling experience can play out.
I agree, Fern. Thanks for doing this. Thanks for being here. And I really appreciate that we're able to talk about this and put words to this experience that a lot of people aren't aware of on the outside of this. So again, I look forward to our next talk where we'll be able to touch on other subjects that are particular to sibling estrangement, and I'll be seeing you sometime very soon. All right, thanks, Fern.
Great to be with you.
Likewise. Bye-bye.